Welcome to the Mental Health Boot Camp Podcast.
Bing, 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 bing.
This is the podcast where 4 psychotherapists, 3 of us Canadian, 1 of us American, serve you cutting edge mental health knowledge. I am Dr. Ryan Howes, a clinical psychologist from Pasadena, California.
And I'm Dr. Brooke Lewis, a registered clinical counselor from the Greater Vancouver area.
And I'm Joanna Boyd, also a registered clinical counselor from the Greater Vancouver area.
I'm Chris Boyd, psychotherapist from Port Moody.
There you are.
Yeah.
Port Moody. I don't think you've said Port Moody before.
Just trying to switch it up, you know.
Rotation before.
Is it inaccurate? Have you moved? What's going on here? I thought you're from
I think
Coquitlam.
technically I work in Coquitlam and I live in Port Moody. So both are applicable.
I got it.
And I guess you would work in Port Moody when you're working virtually from the house.
That's true. And both are technically in Greater Vancouver.
So it's
Wow.
all correct
So it's all correct
and confusing.
and confusing. Yeah, that's true too.
Happy American Thanksgiving to you guys. I am
Gobble,
thankful.
gobble.
Gobble, gobble. Let's hear we have to, I guess annually we have to hear Jo do her great
Oh.
turkey thing. Let's do it, Jo.
Oh my gosh.
It's pretty good.
Okay.
Pretty good.
I totally forgot. Oh, that's great.
She does a fantastic job. It's like you grew up with turkeys or something. Like you have a real insight into the turkey voice, the vocalizations.
That's great.
Videos.
I gotta say, I watched a show actually just last night on PBS. Do you guys have PBS up there?
We do.
Yep.
Even though, isn't that a US thing? Public broadcasting service? Is that? Anyway.
Well, we have it.
Oh, it definitely is. Yeah, we pick it up. Yeah.
You have it, and it was called My Life as a Turkey, I believe is what it's called.
Oh my goodness.
And it's about a guy who was there when he it's a show. The show is called Nature, and the episode is called My Life as a Turkey. And he was there for some reason. He had a whole like a dozen eggs of turkey eggs that were left on his porch, and he was there when they were born. And then he made these sounds to the turkeys, like a mother turkey sound, and they all like imprinted. They bonded to him. They saw him as mother, and so he spent the next year raising these baby turkeys to become full-grown turkeys. And it was a really interesting episode. I highly recommend it for anybody who's interested in development. He talked about how like they taught him about like how they enter the environment. Like the turkeys would walk around, and it was interesting that like the wildlife, when he was walking around with these dozen turkeys, the wildlife would come out, the snakes, the squirrels, the deer. It's like they were like he got a hall pass kind of like into what nature is really like when
So cool.
when it's actually just natural creatures interacting with one another. And he also had to experience the leaving, the fact that they all kind of reached a bit of maturity and left him as the mother, and kind of went off into their own life. And it was a really interesting little piece.
Kind of reminiscent of the octopus one
Yeah.
a little bit.
I didn't watch that one, but I've heard a lot about it.
Just
Yeah,
really
hope,
being able to like see the world of an octopus, right? Like, yeah.
Yeah. I hope that the turkey story doesn't end off with Thanksgiving.
I know. I was wondering too. Oh,
It doesn't. These are wild turkeys. They're not the type that are raised to be eaten on our Thanksgiving.
No, that's good.
But
No.
but they,
Yeah.
they're in nature. Natural things happen. There's a circle of life going on. So it's not all fun and games, but it was a really interesting show. It was great. It was so nice just to see how receptive he was to like what the turkeys were teaching him.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So Joe, let's hope just perfect that turkey call and eat some turkey
Work on
eggs, and you're set. Have a little crew.
Working on it for sure.
Yes. And on that note, I also ate some turkey tonight. So these were not ones that I raised, or I was not their mother. I just bought some from the store and ate some turkey, and it was really good.
Good. So did you prepare it in any special way?
I had, instead of doing a full turkey, did 2 turkey breasts, and did one baked in the oven, kind of a more conventional style, and another one that I was a little more, took a little chance with, and I marinated this turkey breast and I cooked it on the barbecue. And I actually think the barbecue turkey turned out a little bit better, had a little more flavor to it. It's really nice. And then a lot of the conventional things, the mashed potatoes and the green beans, and a nice, we didn't do pumpkin pie, we did an apple pie for dessert. Really good. I'm
great.
fully stuffed and very much looking forward to one of my favorite Thanksgiving traditions, which is the turkey sandwich on the day after.
It is a popular sandwich.
Oh,
For sure.
oh, so good. So good.
Well, that's great.
So yes, reach me on a good night. I really like this holiday. Requires very little in terms of consumerism. We just buy our food, eat it, and then we get ready for Christmas, which requires a lot of shopping. So
Yeah, nice way to be thankful prior
Yes.
to the biggest
Yeah.
consumer day of the year.
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yep.
Absolutely.
That's great. You watch some football? Or
I was
something else,
so busy preparing and cooking stuff. I didn't watch any football today, but I know that's a big tradition for the day too. But you guys, you were saying that in Canada, you guys get to appreciate some of the runoff from America, which is this is a big football day for you guys, and you don't have to do throw a big family party.
No, but we do have to work all day.
Oh, there's that. Yes.
Oh,
It's also not a holiday. That's right.
No.
Yeah. So I get to check fantasy football on my 5-minute break, see what's going on.
Whereas your Thanksgiving was like a month and a half ago, right?
It was, yeah. But Black Friday is becoming a big thing up here. So we have adopted that tradition, American tradition.
So you can get there bright and early and get there, rush into the store so you can get 5% off the TV that you want to buy or something, right?
You know it. Yeah.
Big
Go for
deal.
that 75-incher.
That's it. Right. Yes. Well, I'm thankful for you guys. I'm thankful to have a podcast tonight. And I'm also thankful that our Joe, who is, I feel like we're just still welcoming you back, even though you've been back for a few episodes here, but like Joe's back and she gets to present the ambush for tonight, right?
Yeah. Should I send it over? Are we doing it?
Let's
Yes.
Do it.
Let's do it.
All right.
Ambush. Joe knows the topic. None of the rest of us do. So here we go, everybody. Ready? On Thanksgiving, here is our topic. How do perceptions of gender identity, and sexual orientation impact the well-being of people?
Great.
Gender identity, and sexual orientation impact the well-being of people.
I have a clarification question for you.
Sure.
We have a guest.
We have a guest.
I'll wait till Bryan joins us.
Yes.
Hello.
Hey, Bryan.
Hello.
Wow. Oh,
Bryan, welcome. So nice to meet you.
Thank you. Nice to meet all of you.
so this is my friend Bryan. I actually met him through a local organization called Chasing Sunrise. It's kind of a community group. And I thought it would be fun to have Bryan come on, given his work. So I'm going to just read a little bio about him before we get going. So Bryan has been working as an intermediate elementary school teacher for more than 20 years now, right?
Yep.
Yeah. In addition, he has worked as a faculty associate and sessional instructor, teaching courses in language arts, methodology, as well as classroom management, as well as facilitating teacher education modules with diversity and literacy themes. He currently holds a district leadership role as a sexual orientation and gender identity support teacher for elementary schools. And so you might hear SOGI is that acronym. He has demonstrated a passion for writing and enjoys facilitating rich writing experiences for students so that they develop the comfort and become oh my gosh. You're making me nervous, Bryan, here. And become experimental with language and composition. So in addition, he is very sensitive to the issues surrounding boys and their learning and strives to provide instruction that is highly motivating for all students and that allows students opportunities to achieve their highest potential. So he is also an advocate for ensuring that LGBTQ+ students and their families see themselves reflected in curricular resources, lessons, and conversations by promoting themes of diversity and acceptance. So Bryan has presented all over our lovely province, and we are very fortunate to have him here today to talk to us on these important topics. So welcome, Bryan, and thanks for being here.
Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh.
And
That's great.
so how does this work? Do I just
I know, right? So typically Ryan here is a bit of a facilitator
okay.
Of questions, but we also just have a general discussion. There might be a little bit more geared to you, the questions or feedback. I have one right out of the gates. Typically, we like to define our terms before we get started. So gender versus gender identity. What else do we have on there? Sexual orientation. And was there one more?
That's it.
That was the 3.
Gender identity, and sexual orientation. That's right.
Yeah. So that was going to be my question before you popped on, just given I feel like research in this area and education and awareness has really boomed over the past 5-10 years.
Yeah.
And I'm curious for you, maybe you could answer this, but just the difference between gender versus gender identity as of current, because I would, go as far to say that we would just swipe out the word gender and just go with gender identity currently, right? So, but I could be very wrong on that.
Yeah, it's complex. And so we try to sort of narrow it down to simple definitions. And so I'll go through sort of what are the 4 key terms that we kind of tend to refer to in SOGI. And so the first is we refer to sex assigned at birth. And so basically an infant is born, doctor takes a look and says, oh, looks like a boy, looks like a girl. And of course, sometimes there are situations where they kind of go, not entirely sure. And so that's what we refer to as sex assigned at birth. And it's typically, what genitalia is evident. And often the term sex, in terms of defining by genitalia, gets confused with the word gender. Because gender is more related to a couple of things, because one is gender expression that we talk about. And gender expression is generally sort of anything that we do, that we, behaviors, our appearance that sort of outwardly show our gender. So it could be things like choices about makeup, choices about hairstyles, things like that. And then we talk about gender identity. And gender identity is essentially, we often use a brain as sort of the symbol of it. And it's how you perceive your own gender. It is how you think and perceive the world as it relates to gender. And so within gender identity, we often, and we'll go into more detail about this as we go, but we often talk about people who are transgender, or we might talk about people who are cisgender, and we might talk about people who are non-binary. And so that just means when we talk about someone who is transgender, it means that we're talking about somebody whose sex assigned at birth does not align with their gender identity. And so, for example, someone who was assigned male at birth, but does not identify mentally, emotionally as that gender, and so presents and has a gender expression of the other gender. And then the term cisgender, which is a relatively new term, refers to when our sex assigned at birth and our gender identity are in alignment. So for me, born, doctor said, hey, it's a boy. I've gone through life feeling relatively comfortable as a boy with the body I am in and my sense of self. And so I'm cisgender. And one of the things that's been really helpful in the work that I do and in education in this field is differentiating gender identity and then sexual orientation. And sexual orientation is that sense of who you are emotionally, physically, romantically attracted to. And so I used to myself, when I used to think about someone, for example, who was transgender and then was attracted to the gender that they were assigned at birth. And then I was like, oh my goodness, okay, so how does that work? And when we separate those two things and we just talk about gender identity as one entity and then sexual orientation as another, it's interesting how all these labels that we like to apply suddenly become easier to understand when we have the clarity of those definitions.
Yes, you explained that very well. Just the umbrella categories of the different areas that then we can kind of break down into, right? Because then going into that sexual orientation, there's a lot of other terms in there now as well, right? So
there are. And I guess, and a lot of times when we talk, and particularly when we talk with kids, we talk about gender as a spectrum. We talk about sexual orientation as a spectrum. And one of the ways that I like to sort of engage people with a conversation about spectrum is often when I'm engaging with an audience, I'll ask people who are right-hand dominant to stand up. And so you watch and you kind of see that, 80-ish% of your audience, pushing 90, will stand up because they tend to be right-hand dominant. And then I'll be like, okay, have a look around. And then I ask them to sit down. And then I ask left-handed people to stand up. So you get a smaller number, but they stand up. And then I ask them to sit down. And then I ask the question, have I left anyone out? And what I find really fascinating in terms of doing that particular activity is we understand sort of right-handedness and left-handedness as a binary concept. And when somebody doesn't fit, like, for example, most people will point out the people I've left out are people who are ambidextrous. And so people who are ambidextrous, who don't fit into exclusively right hand or exclusively left hand, we often look at as being exceptional rather than abnormal. And when I think about even my experience, I would consider myself a right-hand dominant person. But if you hand me a hockey stick, I hold it left-handed. I have this interesting habit in my classroom where, particularly when I have kids I know I have to keep my eyes on, I'll be writing on the board and I'll sort of be turned and facing my class right on the board. And then instead of shifting my body, I'll just shift pens and continue writing. And it's quite hilarious because the kids usually are like, but I love the idea of just that sense of, we have this sort of binary concept of right hand, left hand. It's also interesting when we think about how we used to treat left-handed people and try to kind of change that behavior. But it sort of helps to illustrate.
Chris is left-handed.
Yes, we have a
He is to you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Am I on mute? But it's interesting when you start to sort of get that idea of we have this binary, and then there's all of this space in between. And you get people who announce, oh, I can do this left-handed. Oh, I can do this right-handed. And even when we talk about, like when I talk to teachers about inclusion, and people will say to me, oh, I have a very inclusive classroom. And I always ask, do you have a pair of left-handed scissors on your desk? So that if somebody comes asking to borrow a pair of scissors, do you have a pair of left-handed scissors on your desk? And most of us, if we're not left-handed, don't necessarily consider that and prepare for it. So I just find it's a nice way in terms of talking about spectrum, about we have these sort of two really familiar ends of the spectrum. And then we look at all that space in between, and we can do the same thing with sexual orientation. We can do the same thing with gender identity. And what's really interesting is that as we look at the spectrum for things like gender identity, and as we become more accepting of people somewhere in the middle, somewhere that's not necessarily familiar for some of us who are cisgender, it's sort of creating less pressure for people to transition all the way from whatever sex they were assigned at birth, all the way to the other gender. Because another sort of concept or identity that is relatively new for a lot of people are people who are non-binary. And so non-binary can have a number of definitions, because for some people it means that they don't relate either to the female identity or to the male identity, and neither of those labels fits them. And so they might consider themselves non-binary. Others might say, you know what, sometimes I really connect with female, and other times I really connect with male, and there's more of a fluidity between the identities. And again, that's another sort of space of non-binary. And then it gets into that whole space about pronouns and what words do we use when we describe other people.
Smokes. It's a whole, there's so many different, yeah. No, I'm glad you're even like describing as you are, because I just think there's so much to be aware of. And I definitely, yeah, I always enjoy talking with you when we meet up, because I always feel like I learn so much. And it's just sexual orientation, gender identity, and just the LGBTQ plus community. Like I've worked with some individuals, but my knowledge is just so limited. So I'm just always ears open when I'm around you. So I appreciate sharing.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, Bryan. That's very educational for sure. So it seems like in your capacity, you work a lot with the school community. But do you also consult with families as well?
What I primarily do in terms of supporting families is I typically work in supporting families through their schools. So that would often mean I might meet with a parent, with the teacher, with the principal, perhaps with a counselor, and have that conversation. In part because I don't have that relationship that a family has to their neighborhood school kind of thing. And so often I'm sort of called in to consult and to give perspective. And one of the things that I'm often doing is I'm talking to parents who, might have a child, and there's some really young children who are very sort of clear and determined about their identities or even about their attraction. And often it's sort of giving information to parents to kind of get them to take a breath and go, because there's so many perceptions about what it is to be gay, or what it is to be lesbian or bisexual, or what it is to be transgender or non-binary. And we get stuck in some of those stereotypes. And so the parents and the families that I work with, often there's a lot of fear involved. And it's sort of having conversation and helping them understand how important just exploration is. And that, for example, if you have a boy who's in kindergarten who wants to wear a dress, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're trans. And that, the idea of gender reassignment surgery and all of those fears, we don't know. It might just mean that they enjoy experimenting and trying on a dress.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that becomes kind of an issue with a lot of folks, a lot of parents and educators as well, right, Bryan? Like people kind of trying to decide or sometimes even impose their own beliefs onto what that means. Like, are you trying to say that you are you want to identify as female, or is this just a phase you're going through? Tell me about how that is navigated.
Yeah. What's really interesting is that in many cases, the families that I am connected to, often it's the parents who are sort of coming to the school with the story and saying, this is what I'm observing in my child. They might be getting support from other care providers. And so they're being helped in terms of navigating this. And so one of the things that we look at is the 3 C's: insistency, consistency, and persistency. And so particularly when we're looking at young children, when the message that they're communicating is, I am a boy, and it is persistent, and it is consistent, and it is insistent, then we're kind of like, okay, there's some things we need to explore and consider here. If it's sort of a cavalier thing where it's like, oh, I wish I was a girl, then it's not necessarily the same level of concern. And ultimately, what we try to support families to do is to explore social transition. Because of course, social transition, which is basically no medical intervention, it's allowing a child to express sort of in terms of what they're comfortable with, what appeals to them. So it might mean a child that was assigned male at birth wears their hair long and wears a dress to school sometimes. And parents will go, well, I'm afraid of what this means. I'm afraid to send my child to school in a dress. And I'm like, yeah, but you know what? When the school has pajama day, you send your kid in pajamas. And so if that's sort of what's normalized and what is comfortable, then it's okay to do that. And so what we are trying to do, and some of the work that I do with elementary school teachers, is work on teaching kids to just reserve judgment about things like clothing, about things like the length of hair. Because even things as simple as, boys with long hair, if we look at what is typical for many cultures, including indigenous cultures, like long hair is very typical for males in those cultures. And so it's sort of being aware of how, these sort of things play out, but it's all of the stereotypes that are attached to it. And so a lot of the work that I do and that I do with teachers, that I do with families, is trying to deconstruct some of these stereotypes and trying to rewire some of the messaging. For example, I had a group of teachers across a number of schools, and we decided that one of the things we wanted to do in terms of supporting kids who are in social transition is we wanted to educate about, if you look at different periods throughout history, and you look at what was considered gendered clothing in different points throughout history, things like high heels were invented for men and for the purpose of horseback riding. When we look historically at things like wigs, who got to wear the wigs? It was people of nobility. It was typically men. It was people who had elevated status in societies. At one point, pink was considered the color for boys because it was a strong color. And somehow we've come to this place where we've flipped the pink and blue. But it's sort of deconstructing and trying to rewire some of this thinking about, when you walk into a toy store and, just visually, you look down the aisles and you can see the pink aisle with the Barbies. and you can see the blue aisle with the Matchbox cars. And what I think is really fascinating is I have a niece and a nephew who are both 6 years old. They were born about 6 weeks apart. And I love that I can buy them both the same Lego kit and they both enjoy it. And yet there's still marketing tendencies with Lego to market pink bricks for girls and the other bricks for boys.
Yeah. Well, I got to say, Bryan, in the late 80s, early 90s, pink was a very cool color for guys. I had some pink shirts. I felt very, very proud of that, and no social ramifications for that. So I'm just joking around here, but it's you're right. It's a very sociological sort of thing. Like it kind of goes in and out, and right. Certainly there could be some societal norms for that people maybe adhere to a little too strongly, right?
Yeah, it's certainly shifting. We're certainly seeing differences in terms of how some of those things are perceived, but it's also really interesting how some people are so firmly entrenched in those. And the messages that they give, as parents picking up children on the playground, when they see somebody else's child, for example, somebody else's son in a pink outfit, the comments that they make to their child, to other children, to that child wearing pink, is just really kind of fascinating in terms of how we engage in communities.
No, that's a really good point. It's so important, those comments, or ones that I've heard from clients repetitively, is also if they're watching a show with their parent. So the parent, private conversations or conversations around the dinner table, is they're trying to say, we're inclusive, and no matter who you are or what happens in life, we love you, you're fully accepted. Little do they know the child hasn't come out to them yet, and then they're watching a show together and they say, oh, turn it off, or I don't want to see that, or whatever, or there's a judgment or a comment, and the parents are completely unaware that they're giving the opposite impression to their child, which just builds that fear. Yeah, it's very, very powerful.
When it's so interesting in terms of what you're communicating, because I grew up in a household where if there was a gay character on television, which was relatively rare, and if there was someone present, they were usually somehow psychologically damaged, evil, dead by the end of the program. And I can remember just little moments where even my dad, just the body language, the reaction, the disgust. And I think, like, I didn't come out till later in life. I didn't come out till I was 33 years old to my family. And there were so many things and so many fears that were attached to coming out because of those little interactions that my dad probably wasn't even aware were impacting me. And when I tell my story about growing up and sort of the conditions I grew up in, I tell people that I feel like for a very long time, I didn't know what unconditional love was, because I can remember getting to be about 8 or 9 years old, and I can remember stopping hugging my dad because guys don't hug guys. And, all of these little things where in my mind, there were all of these doubts about if this information was shared with my family, whether or not they would accept me. And I'm very fortunate because when I did come out, there was obviously some difficult conversations, but I've had a very supportive family, and I wish that I had more faith in their support, because coming out later was hard. It was hard to live for that length of time and not be my authentic self. And so, as educators, as counselors, as people who have, caring professions, all we really want is for people to be able to explore their authentic selves, because we know that it creates kind of the best opportunities for growth, for learning, for development, for interpersonal interactions, relationships, the whole shebang.
Bryan, I'm curious, how is it going? Like how is your process within the school system? Do you find resistance? Do you find that people are receptive to that? How is that whole process going for you?
For the most part, I would say it's been really positive. It's interesting because I sort of occupy a bit of a unique space in how I approach this in the school system, because I really focus on bringing representation into the classroom, on building understandings through existing curriculum. And some advocates and activists around SOGI get really focused on vocabulary and on defining terms, and defining not just those 4 sort of essential terms that I talked about at the beginning, but like all of the terms. And so sometimes what happens is we get a negative reaction because a child comes home with a new term, and we're dealing with, in many cases, generations of parents who haven't had this education. And so we certainly have had situations where parents have been startled or unprepared. There's been a debate about whether or not we should be having these conversations. Should we be having these conversations with kids? And my mission is to shift the conversation from should we be having these conversations to how do we have these conversations in developmentally appropriate ways. And so we've certainly had our share of resistance when my school district first started to propose a policy that was going to be LGBTQ plus inclusive. We had protests, we had pickets at the board office. We had a very loud, vocal group of parents, a very small group of parents, but a very loud group of parents. And what was really interesting is that for me, I hadn't really done this in my classroom. I hadn't had these conversations in my classroom before this opposition. And when this opposition sort of erupted, and it was featured in our community paper quite routinely, I decided, I felt like I had an obligation to do something, to say something. And so that's how I started my conversations. And at the time, I was teaching at a school that was about 4 blocks from a major church community where the opposition was very embedded. And so the way that I've approached it is to be really strategic, and to, not every educator is a social justice warrior, but every educator delivers curriculum. And so when you can give them material that is sensitively handled, that is engaging activities that include non-binary, trans, queer characters, and the focus isn't necessarily on, let's understand, because this book has a gay character, instead of putting the focus on, well, then let's understand and explain what gay is, it's more like, let's think about the connections we make to the situation. Can you relate to feelings that the character is experiencing? Can you relate to experiences that they're having? Can you make predictions about it? So it's sort of using literacy strategies to address some of the topics. And so in that approach, I've had a lot of success, and I've even had enthusiasm. And I think that there's been people from faith organizations who've sort of gone, oh, you know what? This isn't as threatening as we thought it was. Because there is an awful lot of misinformation and disinformation that is out there, that is designed to scare people, that, queer people are coming for all the children. And it's just not the case.
Yeah. Are there some common myths that you have faced? And can we, bust some of those myths tonight?
Yeah, well, for one, the idea that there's a gay agenda, for one. People will say, oh, that's just part of the gay agenda, to which I'm always disappointed that I haven't been invited to brunch to discuss the gay agenda. And I will say, I don't know what the gay agenda is, but I talk about what my agenda is, and that I want people to be able to have happy, healthy relationships with all the people they interact with. So that's kind of one of them. The other is that, any exposure to gay or trans identities, any introduction of that as a topic is going to make kids gay or make kids trans. And it's just not the case. And it's always kind of interesting because my response to that is typically, listen, I grew up in a school system where every story, every film, every example featured heterosexual characters. And I even grew up in a household full of heterosexual people, and it didn't make me straight. And so, people talk about the other sort of big, continuing misconception is that being gay or being trans is a choice that we make. And often accepting it is the choice that we make. It's not like, I even have a bit of a tension with my brother because he uses the term sexual preference. And I'm like, no, it's sexual orientation. And those are two different things. And he'll push back and he'll go, well, I'm attracted to redheads. That's my preference. And I'm like, okay, that's fine. But when it comes to sexual orientation and you say that you have this preference for redheads, does that include redheaded men? And he's like, no, of course not. And I'm like, then we're talking about, you might have a preference for a particular type, but your orientation is heterosexual. And so it's all of those sort of like persistent myths. When we talk about trans people, the myth that trans people are going into washrooms as sexual predators. And the reality is that statistically, and there's lots of evidence and reports on this, what trans people experience in bathrooms is they are typically the victims of harassment and bad behavior in bathrooms. So things like that are things we're trying to combat. The idea of a trans person competing in a sport in a gender that they have transitioned to as being somehow advantageous. And it's interesting because even the International Olympic Committee just updated their guidelines. And there's some good things in the guidelines and there's some limitations to the guidelines. But when we start to look at the research and when we start to look at evidence-based material, what is consistently being demonstrated is that trans people are not predators. And I feel like that's the biggest myth, the biggest misconception in this field around SOGI, because I feel like we've got to a space where, for me, as a gay man, I don't feel like there's a ton of opposition and resistance. And I feel like there's sort of this place where we've got to this point where people are like, okay, yeah, we get it. There's gay people. And it's almost like they've abandoned the fight with gay people, lesbians, bisexual people, because now all the energy can be directed at trans people. And so it's kind of this interesting space. And even when I stepped into my role, I was surprised how much I had to learn about gender identity and about gender expression, because I sort of stepped into my role thinking, I've mastered this. Like, I'm a pretty good gay person and I can handle all like that material. But it's been interesting how much of my work has been centered around creating the space for young students to explore their gender identity, to create understanding in communities around them. And that's been a lot of my work, hence the sweatshirt.
Yeah. Earlier, I was like, oh, what's going on over there? Out of curiosity, do you think that there's a community or region in North America or even worldwide that you feel like is really leading the way for, providing awareness and education and destigmatization? And I feel like our culture here, or our local community, is trying. I think that we're trying really hard, but I don't really know if there's efforts elsewhere. Are you aware of anywhere that would be considered the kind of the leader in this?
I don't know specifically. I think when you look at urban centers, when you look at places like Los Angeles, you look at New York, you look at Toronto, you look at Vancouver, and I think you see a lot of diversity And so you have communities and you have community organizations who create spaces to support queer communities. You have people who, like you have places where queer people, LGBTQ plus people can go and gather and like be joyous and celebrate. And then you have rural communities that don't necessarily have that sort of infrastructure that makes it challenging. And so what often happens is because those structures don't exist in some of those places, the LGBTQ plus people can't wait to leave there. And they head to places like Toronto, to Vancouver, to LA, to New York. And there's plenty of other places. But I think in many ways, Canada is in a good spot and has done some leadership. And there have been progress made in terms of federal policies, in terms of provincial policies, even the difference between same-sex marriage in Canada and the process of same-sex marriage in the United States is quite different in terms of permission and in terms of when it was established.
How's that different, Bryan? Because I don't think many of us in the States know about that. How is that different?
Well, see, when marriage equality happened here in Canada, it was nationwide. And so provinces didn't have the ability to sort of combat that. It was just federally determined. And so you didn't have the kind of bakery situations in little pockets of Canada, whereas you've had a lot of sort of referendums and sort of more local or state election where it's been more of an issue. And for us here in Canada, it was just federally established.
I see.
Sure. And like even some of the federal language in the states applies to like the sort of the national language applies to employees of the government in the different states, but not necessarily everyone else in the state. And so like there's that sort of complexity with laws and stuff in the states. And you look at like worldwide, there's certainly still countries where being gay is punishable by death, that imprisonment. And we're slowly starting to see how the world is becoming more accepting, and you see different countries passing laws, decriminalizing, and things like that. It was really interesting because when India decriminalized homosexuality, a lot of people were like, oh, look, they're finally becoming progressive. And what's really interesting is when you look at a place like India and you look at other Eastern cultures as well, and their understanding of things like gender and gender expression and gender identity. In India, it's quite historical that they recognized a third gender. In Indigenous cultures, many Indigenous communities will use the term two-spirit. And it's a complex understanding, but it's a very nuanced understanding of gender identity, of sexual orientation. And people who had those were considered similar to people who were ambidextrous. They were considered to have the spirits of both male and female. And that was considered exceptional. And so there were people in communities who were gay or lesbian or trans who kind of were elevated. And then a lot of those understandings and a lot of that acceptance, of course, was undermined by colonization when people came in and said, you can't practice these cultures and these beliefs anymore. And it's slowly, as we look at, this very slow process of truth and reconciliation, you're starting to see communities sort of reestablishing those traditional beliefs around that sort of extraordinariness of people who don't fit into those exclusive categories of male or female.
So Bryan, let's bring it back to the original question from Joe, which had to do with the the well-being of people, right? And we're going to bring it back to our mental health boot camp ideas here of like, how can we help people live healthy lives? So when considering things like sexual orientation, gender identity, LGBT plus issues, what can we take from this as far as well-being and like just healthy people in general? What do you think?
Well, I think a really sort of important understanding is that when we look at people who come out, when we look at people who are part of queer communities and who identify in whatever regard, the fact that they identify in those ways is not typically what requires sort of intervention or support. It's often that they're in environments that might be hostile to those identities. And so, you know, what we're trying to do at the school level is to create communities of acceptance, to, you know, even things like normalizing pronouns, so that, you know, you'll notice that I have my pronouns displayed in my profile name. And what it communicates is the whole idea of, listen, I know that this conversation is going on. I want to be a part of this conversation. And I am open to people who are gender diverse and who use different pronouns. And what I'm trying to do when I put my pronouns in my profile is to encourage everyone to put their pronouns in their profile, because then it normalizes it and it doesn't become incumbent on the person who uses, for example, they, them pronouns to make the announcement, to explain that to everyone. And so things like that, gestures like that, you know, traditionally we have had libraries that weren't necessarily diverse and featuring stories where we saw a range of people identified. And when we look at, over the past few years, we look at movies like Black Panther, and we look at movies like Crazy Rich Asians, and we look at movies like Love, Simon. Those are movies that people went to, and like you can find YouTube videos of people's reactions to those movies that are so joyous because they're seeing people like them represented in a way that is positive and powerful. And so you just see people who are just so excited, and it's so exhilarating because they're seeing themselves represented. And those three movies that I mentioned, and I should probably add Shang-Chi, I can't remember the whole title, but those movies are movies that for years and years, Hollywood was saying, we can't make these movies because they won't make money and people won't go see them. Right. And so now that we've had better representation on the small screen, better representation on streaming services, we're starting to see and relate to people that have experiences that aren't our lived experiences. And hopefully what it's doing is it's creating more empathy. And hopefully what it's doing is it's spurring people into action. Because one of the biggest things that I've noticed is we get these waves where we get opposition. And I'm almost in some ways thankful for the loud opposition, because what it does often is it makes people who sort of sit in moderate spaces go, you know what? I really don't want to be identified with that. That's hateful. That's ignorant. I don't want to be identified with that. So I'm going to shift my behavior and I'm going to create more awareness. I'm going to be more open. And so I think we're seeing more allyship. We're seeing more examples of, you know, when homophobic language is being used, of people saying, hey, that's not okay. And even to see that, you know, like soccer leagues and football leagues are starting to find people who are using derogatory language on the field, because it communicates a message that we need to be respectful and that we can't use derogatory slurs to communicate with people. And I think it's things like that where we start to make people accountable for behavior that makes a big difference. And I think when you look at a lot of companies, they're genuinely interested in creating environments where more voices and more diverse voices are heard. You think of things like affirmative action policies and how some people that can actually make them feel very defensive because they feel like somebody's getting an advantage. But this idea that we're creating communities that actually reflect the communities around them. And I think all of those things, the sort of affirmation, the freedom to explore, the support, because when we have a lot of concerns about, kids who are at school and they're communicating, coming out about their orientation, coming out about their gender identity, we want one of the things we want most is for them to be able to maintain communication with their families so that they have a support network, because of course supportive networks are like hugely influential in positive outcomes. And so it's all of those things combined of just, creating awareness, enhancing representation, calling out inappropriate, problematic behavior, inappropriate, problematic language. It's all, and doing it. So sometimes when, we have these spaces where somebody uses, a derogatory term, and then we kind of pull them aside privately and say, that's not okay. But sometimes to actually address that behavior in front of the person that it is directed at, and to everyone who's a bystander to that interaction, becomes a powerful way of saying, this is not okay.
Wow. I have a quick question for you, Bryan. I think, and I don't know how much time we're going to have here, but just in my work, I've talked to a few parents, and I just want to see what you would suggest parents whose kids might be questioning their gender identity, and you might hear from parents, well, they're so young, or they have so much going on, they're a teen, they have so much going on at this time in their lives, or how do I know it's not their response to getting bullied or not fitting in, and I don't. Anyways, it's just all this questioning they have. What would you say to a parent like that, or are there resources that you would suggest to a parent so they can go and get support or to learn? Yeah.
If I can build on that a bit, I've had similar conversations with parents in that circumstance, and these are often very compassionate, attuned parents, right? And but there are a lot of confusion. They're not quite sure, and there's fear there. I think underneath it all is a lot of fear in terms of what may happen, and you're right, like Joanna mentioned, like sometimes there's challenges or difficulties and trauma or developmental side of things. So a lot of confusion, right? So yeah, good question.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I always encourage parents to do is sort of reflect and just ask themselves, what have you noticed that sort of aligns with what your child is saying? Mm-hmm. What have you noticed that doesn't necessarily align with what your child is saying? Because I think when we often sort of, it's pretty rare that a child who say is 13 and comes out as, feels like they're transgender or non-binary, like there's typically a history, not in all cases, but there's typically hints. And like, I joke with my parents about some of my experience as a child, and I'm like, how did you not know? So there's always sort of that element. And I think it is helpful to sort of get parents to just reflect and to sort of examine, what have I noticed? Because sometimes we haven't been attentive to some of the things that are going on. And then I would encourage them to read, to, follow. There's probably some really good people, and I can't think of any offhand. I used to follow Amanda Jetty Knox, who is a Canadian. She's a writer, and she has a transgender partner and a transgender child. And she's quite skillful at sort of responding to hateful comments online. And it was really interesting because I did follow her for quite some time, and I just sort of sat in that space, not to comment, not to engage, but to listen. One of the people that I follow on Instagram is Alok Vaid Manon, and their perspectives on gender are life-changing. They're a person of color, they're genderqueer, non-binary, and just the stories that they share about how they want to express themselves, about the kinds of things they experience out in public. And when I first started following them, it was uncomfortable because there were things about it that I'm like, oh, there's a bit of a spectacle. But as I just sat in that space and absorbed and listened, it was really, really informative. And part of what is really informative is the responses to transphobic comments, because they respond with such respectful, dignified, thoughtful responses. So there's lots of sort of organizations, particularly again in urban centers. We have a number of organizations. We have Trans Care BC here in BC. PFLAG, Parents and Friends of, can't remember the rest. Yeah.
Gays, yeah.
Some days there's so many vowels that I have trouble. But they can be a good support group in terms of networking. A lot of parents go to sort of Facebook groups. And one of the things we tried to do, we host a number of events in our district, and the events that we host are primarily for students, but we were all set to have a family event that was kind of going to be elementary focused. Bring your family. We were going to have some sort of informational booth, some entertainment, and then of course, COVID hit. But our intention in doing that, and we're trying to explore how we create a situation now with the restrictions that we still have in place, but our intention was to try to provide ways that parents could connect with other parents. Because some of just those conversations about, this is what I'm dealing with my child, oh, that sounds really familiar, or, oh, I haven't encountered that, become, I think, really powerful ways for parents to develop understanding. And when you're able to talk to someone who's sort of been through some of the stages, some of the questions, some of the concerns that you've had, it's often really helpful because it does give you perspective. Because sometimes if we're getting perspective from people who don't have that lived experience, it's a very different perspective.
Yeah, there's I think that's helpful. I think I know there's a lot of resources out there, but I think you naming those few.
When I think too, a really good place to start is here in BC, for example, we have all of our school districts. There's 60 public school districts in BC, and they all have SOGI policies. And so even having a parent connect with their school and ask the school, ask their district, like what is in place, what kind of supports are available. And most school districts are able to provide that information or provide a referral to someone who can.
Noted. That's good to know. Or just send them your way, maybe. But
Yeah, maybe so.
Your own school first. I know you can only do so much, and you're a busy guy. So.
Yes, Bryan, you're a wealth of knowledge. Guys, do we have some more questions for Bryan? Have we addressed some of the issues here, or what else have you got? Okay, well, Bryan, I've got to say, this has been, I've been uptaking so much of the knowledge here that you've shared with us. This has been a wonderful time to spend with you, and I thank you so much for all the work that you do, and also for sharing some of that work with us.
You're very welcome. I have a lot to say on this topic, and it's really nice to just have an opportunity to connect with some other people and hopefully give some perspective, and let's all just work together to make the world a better place.
Yeah,
I agree.
absolutely.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking your Thursday night and coming on here and chatting. And yeah, I'm just so glad that Chris and Brooke and Ryan got to kind of hear some of your thoughts and your insights. So it's
Absolutely.
I agree. This has
Yeah.
been a topic that I wanted to address for a long time, and I'm so glad that we got to do that and got to do it with you, someone who's right there in the trenches and doing all the work really firsthand. So thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome.
So that's it for us tonight. Everyone listening, like and subscribe on Apple, Google, Podbean, Audible, Spotify, Stitcher, or YouTube. Send your questions to info@mentalhealthbootcamp.com. Visit us on Facebook or Instagram. Tell a friend or two. And thank you so much for being here tonight, everybody. We're thankful for you.
Yeah.
Good night,
Everybody,
everybody.
thanks for listening.
Good night.
Good
Good night, everybody.